All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Dana Slowinski, and I am co-owner of Family Recovery Centers. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. We have a very informative and I believe engaging webinar with Rayell and Sarah of Head Heart Therapy. I wanted to take just a minute to give a little bit of information on Family Recovery Centers. We are an evening adolescent intensive outpatient program. We have locations in Lake Bluff, Hoffman Estates, and St. Charles, and we have a fourth location coming this fall, so stay tuned for details on that. We work, two program highlights, we work with a wide range of adolescents, so adolescents struggling with maladaptive behaviors such as self-injury, substance use, mood disorders. And two program components I'd like to highlight are parent involvement. So parents are actually involved in the therapy process 2 of the 4 evenings with their adolescent. So they're actually on site with their adolescent, learning didactically the skills, and then they're also doing their own work. So we're really diving into their role and their dynamic within the family so that we're really wrapping around that whole family system and so that we're addressing the family system. And then we also have a 24/7 on-call. So our clinicians are available to both the adolescents and parents 24/7 so that we can help them, coach them through skills in their own real life environment, not just when they're on site with us. And that is us in a very quick nutshell. So if you have questions, if you want to talk further about Family Recovery Centers, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Ryan Bright, and we can answer any questions for you. We are also, because we're expanding and growing, we are hiring. So if you know of anyone that is interested, please feel free to send them our way. I will put my email in the chat, so you've got that if anyone is interested. And with that, we are always so grateful for our community relationships, and Head Heart Therapy is one of those wonderful collaborators and relationships that we have, and we are so grateful to have them with us this morning. So I will turn it over to Sarah and Rayell.
Thanks so much, Dana. We are very, very excited to be here and to share this topic that is extremely important to Head Heart Therapy and specifically to me and Rayell today. And I do have a link for the slides. I will grab that and share that with you in the chat once Rayell starts talking, because I didn't get that ready just yet, but we'll do that so you can have all of those later. So, if you're not familiar with Head Heart Therapy, we are a group therapy practice on the north side of Chicago and specialize in trauma and addiction and LGBTQ populations. And many of our therapists also actually specialize in working with race-based trauma as well. So that's a little bit about us. And specifically for the purposes of this presentation, Rayell and I are going to introduce ourselves not necessarily as professionals, but as racialized bodies and sharing our identities as it relates to the material today. So I am white, as you can probably guess, and my origins are mostly Irish and German heritage. I am from Southern Ohio, so just outside of Cincinnati, and Cincinnati is I haven't been there in almost 20 years now, but when I was growing up, it was a really racially charged area, and I had no idea. It was completely outside of my understanding, and it wasn't until I moved to Chicago that I was able to reflect on the racism that was swimming all around me as I was growing up. Speaking of that, my great-grandfather was unfortunately a member of the KKK, and my father was an admirer of Hitler. And because I'm white, my ancestors were part of colonization of this land and causing great harm to indigenous people and all people of color. And so for me, anti-racism is a daily practice that I engage in order not just to heal myself, but to really support those who will come after me. And I also believe my ancestors who came before me.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. I wish we could actually see some of your faces. I'm sure there's some familiar ones out there. So my name is Rayell. I am a Black, cisgendered, able-bodied, educated woman. I am impacted by racism every day due to the color of my skin. I am born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri. And I grew up in a multiracial home. So my mother's husband was born and raised in Germany. So I grew up with a white father. And majority of my upbringing, I attended Catholic schools. I was always the only Black person in majority of the spaces of my life growing up, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the presentation, until I got to about college, actually. And so Sarah and I will chat more about identity and things, but I think me actually coming into my identity and owning my identity as a Black woman is something that, yes, is continuously ongoing, but actually being able to step into that space has taken quite some time, and to continue to stay in that space. So part of my personal growth journey is really rooted in anti-racist, anti-oppressive work, which we'll, of course, yes, chat more about here later on. And it's a continued piece of my own personal journey, of my healing journey, and all of the things that make me who I am today.
Tee-hee, I'm muted. All right. So we've got some pretty lofty goals for our short time together today. What is really, really important to us, not just the information that we share with you, but a desire for some level of embodiment in this information. You know, the more work that I do personally with anti-racism, and the more that I'm seeing it around me, the disconnects that I feel like I'm tuning into are when people just want to, quote unquote, do it right. And they just want the information without figuring out how to live the information. So that's really our biggest hope for you today, is that you take whatever intellectual information that we give you and you figure out a way to embody it and be with the information from a deeper level. So today we are going to, Rayell is going to talk about key terms and their impact in mental health. We're going to talk about what the work is, what we see that as. We're going to introduce terms called injected racial oppression and injected racial superiority. And we'll be sharing examples of anti-oppressive values in practice, hopefully that you will be able to take. And then we are going to need two brave people to do an experiential with us at the end here. So be thinking, if this material feels like something you're able to show up with today, be thinking if you'd be willing to unmute and participate in that experiential for all of us. Now I pass it back to Rayell.
So now that we kind of have the plan and the objectives of what we're going to be chatting about today, I'd like for all of us to really take a quiet moment here to really center and ground yourselves in our space today. So I know it's only Wednesday, but I feel like, I feel like I've been so busy already in the middle of the week. And I am an early bird, so I'm always running around in the morning. I'm commuting to the office. I'm trying to get coffee. I'm trying to go to the gym. I'm trying to do all of these things, which I'm sure is something that resonates with all of you in the space today. And so I'd like for us to really just get settled, because some of the information that we talk about today may bring up some discomfort for you. I know that hearing, right, the word, racism, or, privilege, or, discrimination, all of these things can really sometimes bring up some internal sensations and emotions that maybe we are not necessarily aware of. So we're going to step into an embodiedness awareness activity, and that it really just allows us to connect with the present moment, really by using our bodies, using our breath, some sensory experiences, and just really paying attention to our thoughts and feelings in a non-judgmental way. And so we're going to be here just for a few minutes. So please do not feel that you have to participate by any means, but I would like to invite all of you to just take a moment before we really jump into the material. So if you are sitting somewhere, get comfortable where you're sitting. Take a moment to get yourself comfortable in your position, and make sure you have some openness in the front of your body. So you can roll your shoulders up, you can roll them back. You want to have some uprightness or length in your spine without being rigid or stiff. And you want to invite a softness into the face, the jaw, the shoulders, and the belly. So this balanced posture of being both relaxed and alert, being both soft and open, is the beginning of the embodied awareness. And if it feels comfortable, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes or simply just allow your gaze to be soft. And notice how the body's feeling in this moment. You don't need to change anything about the mind, the thoughts, or your heart, emotions, or any sensations. Just simply allow what's happening to be in your awareness. And how does your body feel right now? Really feeling what's going on physically or mentally. What sensations are you experiencing? Where may there be tightness or tension in the body? And where is there ease or relaxation? Just notice what's here. And just notice what's present and allow what's happening. Maybe there's thoughts or emotions coming up, and just let everything be here. And notice the breath, and just take a moment in silence to notice your bodily sensations. You don't have to necessarily think about the body, but really just feel into any sensations. And maybe take a deep breath or two in this moment of silence. So even if any thoughts or anything are coming up, it's okay, invite those in. Right? We know that our mind is constantly thinking about the past, about the future, about the present, and it does this constantly. But we know our body's always in the present moment. And bring your awareness to the breath as it flows in and out of the body. Take a couple of deep breaths here. Notice your belly rising and falling as you breathe in and out. And as we end this embodied awareness, take a moment to express gratitude toward yourself for taking the time to cultivate this practice today. And know that in any moment you can reconnect to your body, your breath, the sense of groundedness, to really create spaciousness and ease and rootedness. If you close your eyes, you may open your eyes, move your hands and your feet, and orient yourself to your space. Thank you for those of you that participated.
Thank you, Rayell. What a gift to me this morning. And I forgot to mention in our intro, just logistics, we're open to questions at any time. So I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat as well, truthfully. So wherever you post things, we will we'll attend to them as we see fit. So this is where I get to say, hello, white people. And, you know, obviously I make light of it, but I really want you to think, if you're a white person, how does that feel? How does that feel to hear me say, hello, white people? You know, as white people, we have generally been socialized to believe that it's impolite or improper or, you know, even wrong to talk about race. And that's part of what gets in the way of having these really difficult conversations, is that we as white people think that we aren't racialized bodies or beings. And so the material today, I really want you to, if you haven't before thought of yourself as a racialized person, just really think about what that might mean for you today. And there are some questions here that I invite you to sit with as we move through the presentation. So how am I feeling in my body as I listen to this presentation? As Rayell said, you know, we're going to be using terms like white supremacy and privilege, and oftentimes these can bring feelings of discomfort. So if you notice something in your body, just take note of it. If you do notice discomfort, what are you making up as the source of the discomfort? You know, it's really, really easy to blame the people who are sharing the information, right? So you can totally blame me and Rayell. We're tough, we can take it, but just recognize, right? If you are noticing discomfort, where are you saying is that discomfort coming from? Is it coming from outside, or is it coming from something within you? How do you feel when you're asked to notice your whiteness? As I said, you know, we have been asked to consider ourselves not as racialized beings. So if I say to you, as a white person, you are a racial being, what happens for you internally? And as we go through all of this information today, how do you see yourself in the material? And how do you not see yourself in the material? There will be things that I'm going to guess you will relate to pretty easily. And I think there may be components where you struggle to find connection with that. So we're not trying to necessarily change anything today, but it's an invitation for noticing. And then the last question is, what am I willing to consider that I haven't been willing to consider before today? So I know that I will walk away feeling like this is a successful presentation if even just one person out there creates a little bit more openness to something that was closed before. So if you find yourself, you know, if you're a white person and you're finding yourself struggling with any of the material, I really invite you to go back to these questions to ground yourself and root yourself and continue to show up for this challenge that we're offering for everyone today. Back to Rayell.
So before we jump into all of the definitions, I want to chat about just kind of the importance of language, right? Things that are really important for us to keep in mind as I'm sharing these definitions. And just to provide a gentle reminder here that the information that Sarah and I are sharing today and the definitions that I'm sharing are very different from cultural competency. I know all of us have to take that course while we're in school, right? This is something that is continuous probably throughout our work. And so cultural competency, the idea of just having an awareness, right? Just having some type of knowledge does not include any type of action or structural change. And so that's something completely different. And we know that words and their multiple uses reflect a tremendous diversity that characterizes our society. And universally agreed upon language is almost non-existent when it comes to racism. So we know that even the most frequently used words in any discussion on race can cause confusion, which leads to controversy. It leads to hostility, which is why it's so important that we hold some level of shared understanding, particularly when it comes to common terms. So this way, the quality, the meaning of our dialogue and discourse on race can be strengthened. It continues to be improved, right? It continues to be enhanced. And so we have to also recognize that language has been used to objectify, oppress, divide, and disconnect us from each other and from ourselves. And language can really be used to deliberately engage and support anti-racist partnerships and alliances, initiatives, and it could really be used to divide them. So discussing definitions can engage in and support with those coalitions and partnerships. And so it's important for groups and communities of people to decide the extent at which they have some type of consensus where it's okay for people to disagree. And it's helpful to keep in mind that the words that we use to discuss power and privilege and racism and oppression, while yes, we can look in the dictionary or wherever and we can see definitions to these words, but these words hold very different meanings to all of us. And that makes a lot of sense because we're all very different people. We've all had very different experiences. And we know that language doesn't always communicate intention, right? So when I'm saying something, I'm not saying, hey, the intent of me saying this. That's typically not how we are taught to converse or how we're taught to communicate. So while we can hold this idea about our intention, right? Our intentions most of the time probably are not rooted in a malice and they come from a good place. But we also have to be mindful of the impact of sometimes of the words that we use and how we show up in relation with others. Okay, there's a lot of information on here. I recognize it. I'm going to talk about all of it. So my apologies for this small ass font, excuse me. So as I'm saying, that people are in very different stages of their development, their education, their learning. I know I'm one of those people. I know Sarah's one of those people. And we can often really attach very different meanings to words like discrimination, privilege, institutional racism, and so on. So when people are talking about privilege or racism, the words that they're using are often coming also with emotions, right? And assumptions that are not necessarily spoken. So internalized racism, right? The situation that occurs in a racist system when a racial group oppressed by racism supports the supremacy and dominance of the dominating group by maintaining or participating in a set of attitudes, behaviors, societal structures, and ideologies that undergird or support, right, the dominating group's power. So as people of color, right, are victimized by racism, we begin to internalize that. That is, we really develop ideas, beliefs, actions, and behaviors that support or collude with and uphold racism, and oftentimes without any recognition or knowledge that it's actually happening. Racial equity, right? The condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicated in a statistical sense how one fares. So when we use the term, we're thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice. And thus we include work, right? And in this root cause of inequalities, not just their manifestations. So this includes elimination of major policies and practices, attitudes, cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or that fail to eliminate them. So this mindset is really about solving problems that have endured for generations. They are historical, they're passed down and passed down and passed down, and continue to harm people and communities of color, and ultimately impact all of us, that impacts all races. So this requires us to really step into a space where we are thinking differently, we're seeing the world differently, we're doing things differently. And so racial equity is about results that make a difference and that last, right? That's something that's sustainable. Racial justice, the systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all racial justice or racial equity. It goes beyond anti-racism. So it's not just the absence of discrimination and inequalities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures. So this idea of operationalizing racial justice means reimagining. It means co-creating a just and liberated world that includes understanding the history of racism and the systems of white supremacy and superiority, and addressing those past harms, centering BIPOC people and building communities, cultural, economic, and from a political power sense as well. And also practicing love too, right? How are we practicing love with each other and really going against the status quo, right? Resisting these political things that really surround us and can influence the way in which we show up. Microaggressions, which is, I'm sure, a term that all of you have heard before, which is a term that was coined in the 1970s by a Harvard psychiatrist by the name of Professor Chester Pierce. And microaggressions, right, are these everyday verbal and nonverbal assaults, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that really communicate a hostile, derogatory, or negative messages that target people solely based on their marginalized group. So an example of this would be, I'll use myself as an example because this still happens to me all of the time today, that I get I don't even want to refer to it as a comment, but I get the statement as, you're so eloquent, you're so well-spoken. And sometimes I'll say for a Black girl, for a Black woman, but I understand what this person is communicating to me. right? And we can think about this from, maybe somebody who identifies as Asian or Asian American, right? By commenting on how well their English is, which you're presuming that person is not American, that they weren't born here. Racist policies, right? Any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between or among racial groups. So these policies are written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that continue to govern people. So if we really think about that actual definition, there's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. So every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. So racist policies are expressed through terms such as structural racism, right? Or systemic racism. And racism itself is institutional, it's structural, and it's systemic. So when we hear someone say, oh, he's racist, they're racist, or she's racist, right? We're indicating and we're saying that this person is supporting a racist policy through their actions or their intentions, or they're expressing a racist idea, right? And racist ideas, which is the idea that suggests that one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way, which leads us to power, right? Power is unequally distributed globally and in the US society. So some individuals or groups wield greater power than others, thereby allowing them greater access and control over resources. So wealth, whiteness, citizenship, patriarchy, heterosexism, continue to fill in the blank there. And education, right? These are some of the probably more the common ones that we often name that we're aware of, right? Through which power operates. So power may also be understood as the ability to influence and impose one's belief. So even though power is conceptualized as having, right, this power over, you're exerting something over another person, there's also variations within the context of power, right? It can be used in the context of also building collective strength and power within, right? Our own internal strength that we hold. So learning to see and understand relations of power is really important for really stepping into change and really organizing even progressive social change. So the important concept of power to anti-racism is clear, well, at least to me it is, right? Racism can't be understood without understanding that power is not only an individual relationship, but it's a cultural one, right? It extends outside of us. And that power relationships are shifting constantly. Things are constantly changing all the time. And power can be used malignantly. It can be used intentionally. And individuals within certain cultures may benefit from power from which they're unaware, which it's not up here, which leads me to privilege, right? A special right, advantage, or this sense of immunity granted or available to a particular group of people or a person, right? So this right or benefit given to someone and not others. Something of value one group has that another group doesn't have, simply by belonging to a group. So it's either unearned advantage or it's an unearned entitlement. So privilege equals power. So as I've said time and time again, right, words are powerful. They're very powerful. So the most frequently used words, right, on race can cause confusion. It leads to controversy and hostility, as I said earlier, right? So it's important that we hold some level of shared understanding, right, when we're talking about these words or using them in our own vocabulary, right? Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through institutional policies, practices, right? All of these things in the society that shape our cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practice. So racism equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race. Racism equals a system of oppression based on race. And racism is a white supremacy system. And so we, have heard the word floating around a lot about, anti-racism, right? Being anti-racist. So anti-racism is the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for change in political, economic, or social life, right? It extends outside of us just holding this belief or just saying to ourselves that, oh, I'm not racist, right? It's about the action, it's about the structural change. So anti-racism, right, it is individualized. It looks different for all of us, how we take steps towards that. And it really sets us up for, right, opposition to individual racist behaviors and impact. And then to be an anti-racist, right, is someone who's supporting anti-racist policies through your actions or expressing against anti-racist ideas. This includes, right, supporting policies that reduce racial inequity. Another definition that I don't actually have on here is, as I'm talking about racism, is kind of the culmination of what happens as somebody experiences racism time and time again, is called racial battle fatigue. So racial battle fatigue is a term that was coined in 2008 by William Smith, and it initially was used to reference the experiences of African-American men in the United States, and now it's expanded to describe the negative and racially charged experiences of all people of color. And so racial battle fatigue is this cumulative result of natural, just race-related stress response to distressing mental and emotional conditions. So these conditions have emerged from constantly facing racially dismissive and demeaning, insensitive, or hostile racial environments and individuals and people. So racial battle fatigue is this idea of attempting to deflect racism, stereotypes, and discrimination in predominantly white spaces, which is oftentimes causes people of color to really have the sense of being on guard, right? Or being weary of the next attack, always prepared to how to respond, what's gonna happen. This sense of anticipation, an experience of racial trauma really contributes to racial battle fatigue. And so racial battle fatigue is something that people of color, suffer from in various forms of mental, emotional, and physical strain, which really leads to symptoms that very much mimic those of PTSD, right? Trembling, jumpiness, hypervigilance, anxiety, frustration, mood swings, emotional and social withdrawal. And these symptoms continue to lead to, right, long-term health issues, which can really result in death for some people, right? And really leads to poor health. It leads to a poor sense of self. It leads to poor attitudes, and it leads to poor behaviors, which is probably something that many of us have witnessed or seen.
Hey, Rayell, just to jump in, we had a comment in the chat, and I didn't get any further explanation, but just there's a hope for a little bit more examples of some of these definitions. So as you're moving through the rest of the definitions, if something comes to you, particularly about a client or your own experience, please throw that stuff in too.
Absolutely. And maybe it'll probably show up now as I talk about, right, some of the difference in these words that I'll have examples. But if I don't answer your question in person, please bring that up at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to chat too. So prejudice, racism, and discrimination, what is the difference, right? Prejudice is this irrational or unjustified negative emotion or attitude toward a person from another social group, right? So it's this incorrect, it's a negative attitude toward another individual based on their membership of a certain social group. So for example, somebody can hold prejudice views towards a certain person, right? It's maybe somebody of a certain gender or sex, and we label them as a sexist or genderist, right? The ists would fall underneath prejudice here. Racism, which we just talked about, right? This personal belief in the superiority of one's race over another, this sense of power, right? This is the root of racism. It's linked to racial prejudice and discriminatory behaviors, which can be an expression of implicit and explicit bias. So an example of this would be institutional racism, unfair privileges some individuals from groups have over others, right? All of these things. And as I think about just institutional racism, I'm just thinking of actually a conversation that I had with a really close friend of mine that was in town previously. And she grew up on the south side of Chicago and had this very horrific trauma history. And, you know, I went to University of Iowa, which is, you know, predominantly white college. And she from, you know, the South Side came to college there. And that was like her first experience of being in white spaces and communities. And she went on to, you know, get her PhD and things, but always being in these very white centered spaces. And she said something to me, you know, we were talking about, I was saying to her like, oh, I don't really know anything about you being in high school or middle school. And she's like, oh, I don't like recall those stories. Like, I don't actually know what happened. And so we were talking about the educational piece. And one thing that she said was like, yeah, but I do remember things like being in class, right? Or just living in environments that don't have access to resources. She said, I remember being in like a math class or something and, you know, trying to learn formulas and things. And I'd open my book and I'm missing, you know, pages 6 through 15. And the teacher would have to say, oh, buddy up with somebody else. Like that was my experience of being in school. So it makes sense why maybe some of these things I don't want to recall or actually talk about. And then if we probably went way far up north to Wilmette, that's a whole different story. They probably get new books every year. So I think about just, right, the very difference of the educational system and how that continues to be perpetuated over and over and over and over again. So another example of this too, as I'm talking, would be, you know, apartheid, right? Which literally means separateness, a system of racial segregation. And then we have discrimination, right? Is the behaviors or actions usually negative toward an individual or group of people, especially based on sex, race, social class, etc. And so the difference between prejudice and discrimination, right, is a prejudiced person may not act on their attitude. They may just hold the belief. They may just hold the attitude. So therefore, somebody can actually be prejudiced towards a certain group, but not discriminate against them. And when we combine all of these things together, we're left with oppression, right? The unfair or cruel power to control another person or group of people. This excessive use of power. And oppression occurs, you know, whenever that somebody is really using their authority over another person, this in an unfair way, and essentially just weighing this person down in a controlling way. So this person is weighed down in mind and body. So as I, you know, talk quite a bit about those definitions, which I know it's a lot of information to digest, especially if you're not familiar with some of the terms. I'd just like for all of you to just even think about this question, right? What are some barriers that come up for me when I'm working with my clients or assessing my clients, especially those maybe that have experienced, right, racial violence or racial attacks? I know one of the definitions I actually didn't put on here, you know, or mentioned was just racial trauma, right? Race-based traumatic stress, which is these continuous events, right, of danger related, or it could be real or perceived, of the experience of racial discrimination. So it can include threats, it can include harm, injury, humiliation, shaming, witnessing harm of another person of color, right? That's real or perceived. So as we really think about this information, right, what are some barriers that we think of that maybe have come up for us when not even maybe having these conversations with our clients of color? How can we begin to invite this information or material into our spaces, right? Into our groups, if we run groups, if we're teaching, into our job, into our personal life, right? I can just reflect back on, you know, when I worked in community mental health for quite some time, even just talking about the word trauma was super activating for a lot of the people there, just because they didn't even hold an understanding of what trauma was, let alone racial trauma. And so sometimes that's cause for us to even hold that some of our clients may not even be aware that they've experienced racial trauma. They may not even be able to put a name to what's happened to them. And so as you're thinking about, right, some of the barriers maybe that come up for you, and the list is extensive, not just to the ones that I have listed here, these 4 listed here, but just assessing and, for discriminatory and racial distress in people of color is very important when it comes to healing and when it comes to treatment. And, despite the evidence that racial encounters can be stressful, right, for traumatized people, it's often misperceived or unacknowledged by many people. And that could be due to a lot of barriers, right? But I think these are probably some of the most common ones that we see. A lack of awareness. Like, I just didn't know. Maybe it wasn't taught to you in school. I know it wasn't taught to me in school. I didn't learn that racial trauma could be an impact of even how I show up in my life and how I show up in relationships. I wasn't taught that. Right? Our own bias, right? Just because I'm Black, I don't know about the experiences of every Black person, but I probably can relate to them on certain things. But that doesn't mean I don't know that I know their story, right? Or I know how they've been impacted. Concerns about subjectivity, right? Concerns about ourselves. Feelings of discomfort, which is probably the most common one, right? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And there's also the piece that, even for myself or people who don't identify as a person of color, that we are socialized to demonstrate non-racist values by not talking about race. And this approach really leaves us unprepared, right? It doesn't leave us equipped to have conversations about race with our clients of color or with people of color. And so it's even less likely that we're able to engage in any type of productive conversation surrounding traumatic experiences of racism. And then that leads to oversight. And then that results in inappropriate treatment. It results in misdiagnosing. It impacts your rapport with clients. It impacts somebody's healing, right? It impacts the way that somebody actually shows up, which are all things that are central to being in treatment, to being held, to being supported.
Thanks, Rayell. So just a couple pieces of information in terms of knowing the history of our own professions. Personally, I'm a social worker, and of course, in my master's program, I was taught, about Jane Addams and how altruistic we were as social workers, and we're great people doing the fight. And there are a lot of actually problematic things in the history of social work. So these are just a smattering of things in the very beginning of mental health care. So I really encourage everybody to do some work on learning truly about the history of where our professions began. And so we start with Benjamin Rush, right? So he's the quote unquote father of modern psychiatry. He was around during the late 1700s, early 1800s. So he was a physician, and he was also a political leader, and he was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So you can see here just how important he was in the ecosphere of the time. And he, of course, made very significant contributions to mental health, but he was also incredibly racist. And so it's important to be able to hold both of those and recognize that on one hand, he was moving our profession forward, and in another, causing great harm to people of color. Then we go to Samuel Cartwright. So he was around in the 1850s. And he was a physician in the South, and the Medical Association of Louisiana asked him to do an investigation to, quote unquote, discuss the physical peculiarities of the Negro race. and two definitions that he had come up with, essentially diagnoses. This is before the DSM, but these were diagnoses that he made around slaves, particularly. So drapetomania, you may have heard of. This was the quote unquote condition believed to make slaves run away from their owners, right? So that's obviously blaming the slave instead of looking at the environment and what's wrong with the environment. And then the second one I'm probably going to butcher, but dysesthesia ethiopica. So this was a condition believed to cause laziness in slaves. Again, blaming the oppressed instead of looking at the larger system. So then we have more scientific racism, and this Dr. Louis Agassiz believed that he could justify white supremacy using science. And what he thought that cranial capacity essentially determined intelligence, and then he ranked all of the races based on particular measurements that he had made of skulls. And Caucasians, of course, were at the top, and guess who was at the bottom? Black folks. And then, we have a tendency for Black women to receive less pain medication during medical procedures because it's believed that they have a completely different threshold for pain, thus just sort of proving this disparity between seeing us all as being human and being able to be impacted by painful experiences. And then this last piece, in Alabama and Mississippi, they really wanted to continue segregation even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and they were claiming that it was actually medically necessary to keep the races segregated. So just a couple definitions, and there's unfortunately so much more in the history. And then here are just some.
Sarah,
yeah, please jump in. Go for it.
I say this as I'm a football fan, and I watch sports, and I don't know how many of you have followed this case that's actually in the news. It's actually happening right now about Black football players, essentially even retired ones, not being, they're tested for CTE, but this research is still supporting that because they are Black, that they are more cognitively impaired than their white counterparts. So how does this actually apply? There's like a lawsuit and all this stuff going. There's a big lawsuit. So if any of you are interested in checking that out, it just made me think of that as you're talking about, right? This thing that's so unbelievable that's still happening today, that even some medical professionals still support this idea.
Wow. Thank you for jumping in, because Rayell knows I know nothing about sports. And so of course I would know nothing about this happening in the stratosphere. It's also something to consider. I took a 2.5-day course from an organization called Crossroads. And one of the exercises that we were supposed to do throughout the training was to identify like organizations or things that are already happening in normal life that we consider normal, but actually have a lot of roots in racism. And sports is one of those arenas, because if we think about the people who are playing the sports, more often than not, are people of color. And white owners of teams and coaches are profiting off of the labor of racialized bodies. So that's just another thing to put out there.
That's also a huge thing right now as well, for those of you that watch football and about Roger Goodell, the commissioner, right, of now voicing that even the amount of people of color, Black people that actually own NFL teams, or hell, any big sporting teams, or that are head coaches too. We can look at that in almost any sport, that we don't see people of color at the top. But they are, yes, the ones who are almost the labor forces, right, of these lot of sports.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm gonna skip over some of these statistics because y'all can read them yourself, and I'm pretty sure that you're itching to hear more of the stories and what it is that we really do to push this work forward. So, what is quote unquote the work, and what does it mean to engage in it? And the way that I think about it is doing the work in terms of anti-racism is recognizing our implicit bias bias, examining our relationship to power. I think Rayell did a really beautiful job in talking about what power is and how we can use it over people. And you know what? It shows up in the most subtle of ways. I can think of, I recently actually had an issue with another professional, not a therapist, but somebody in the professional realm, where I was pretty sure, like they thought that I was an unsafe person. And I'm pretty sure that it wasn't because of anything I did in particular, but I think this person gave away their power to me and I had no idea what was happening. And then all of a sudden I'm an unsafe person. And it just helped me recognize on the very subtlest of levels, even when we're meeting with somebody who we are assuming is, has the same amount of power that we do, we can't always move through the world as if we don't have that power. And that's really where I think most harm can be caused, is if we are not aware that we are holding power in any given dynamic. So then also recognizing our privilege, right? So the exercise that we're going to do at the end talks about unearned disadvantage and unearned advantages. So really thinking about how that shows up for us. And regardless of your race, recognizing yourself as a racialized individual. So that's really what I think of in terms of doing quote unquote the work. So this graphic comes directly from a book that we're going to discuss later on, the Racial Healing Handbook. And this is one particular piece of it. And we talk about racial identity development for both white people and for, and we're throwing around the term BIPOC. And I was in a training where someone actually wanted us to say what that acronym means. So just in case you're not aware, it's Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And sometimes you'll see a QT in front of it, and that's really centering, queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So that's what that means. So this racial identity development came from Janet Helms, who was a nurse. She had written this in 1990, and these different areas, it's not linear, right? So you're not going to start in conformity and then like do this beautiful linear progress to integrative awareness. We can do circles. It's just like healing, right? It's not a straight line. So just hold that in mind as I read to you what these different identity pieces are. So when we are, as a white person, in this place of conformity, we are completely oblivious about race, and we live in a world where we believe that racism doesn't exist. And there's an article that talks about opportunities to move towards anti-racism, where we are recognizing our privilege or moving away from racism. Right. So you can see it's a very subtle difference. So moving towards anti-racism is I'm recognizing my privilege, I'm taking action, doing something, rather than just moving away from racism, distancing and avoiding. And that's what I think about in terms of that conformity stage of really just being in this place of avoiding and distancing from ever believing that this applies to me or the world around me at all. And then acceptance it's actually kind of the inverse of what we usually think of as acceptance, but acceptance in terms of racial identity development is a conscious rejection that racism is real. So we're just saying that is not a thing that is happening. And then resistance is where we recognize that racism is real, and yet we find it too difficult to discuss. So that's when we're also kind of actively really pushing away and it's either because we don't know what to say, or maybe we're feeling, a ton of shame or guilt. This piece is, I think, what really gets in the way of us having discussions, really brave, I think, important discussions, because we're pushing away because we don't want to deal with the discomfort of this experience. Then retreat. This is where we as a white person recognize racism and we recognize our particular participation in it. And this area definitely has a lot of shame. I know when I started recognizing this, one of the things that I would want, and I don't know, I probably did say this out loud at some point, but you know, I would want my friends of color to then like, okay, so how do I do it right? That was the thing that I wanted when I was in this part of my identity development. And truthfully, there are times when I feel that again, right? I notice within myself, I've been really, really aware of how internalized racism shows up in me based on, you know, just the general culture and specifically the area that I grew up in. And I was in Lincoln Park of all places, right? Like super white place. If you're from Chicago, you know, like Lincoln Park is where the white people congregate. And there were 3 young Black men and 2 of them had their hoodies up. It's literally 10 o'clock in the morning. Like nothing is going to happen, but I noticed this constriction within me and a desire to like make sure that I could keep myself safe. And there's nothing about what's happening around me that says that. It really just is this internalized prejudice and racism you know, that's telling me that it's not safe to be around these, you know, Black youth with their hoodies up. And if I were in the retreat stage, what I might have done is really just shame myself for feeling that way, thinking, oh, you know, I'm so terrible for still being racist and yada, yada. But instead I recognize that this is what I'm trying to unwind. And if I don't notice these internal reactions of racism, then I can't do anything about it. So then we move into this emergence and integrative awareness. And this emergence is where we're ready to move into action and we begin to educate ourselves and we speak out and we speak up for people. We're willing to take some action rather than just kind of keeping it to ourselves. And then the integrated awareness beyond that is being curious about our other identities other than just our racial identity. So my identity as a cis female, my identity as a bisexual woman, you know, all of the different identities that I have as an able-bodied person, right? All of these different things, beginning to explore what that process was like of that identity development, which then can help us have more of an appreciation for the identity development of people of color as well.
So I'm going to talk about the racial identity development model from the standpoint of, you know, I'll probably have some examples of myself being in here, being a Black woman. And of course, you know, as Sarah and I are talking about these identity development models, right? This is not the only identity development model that's out there, right? I think a lot of them have a lot of overlapping information and they may use different words, but, you know, for the most part, they all almost hold, right, this same understanding. And so your racial identity development really is about these stages or these processes of your experience and your learning about your own identity. And when it comes to race, really developing a positive identity is important. And a positive racial identity means that you're secure in your racial identity, right? You're aware of the history of your racial group. And you're able to identify when you're being racially stereotyped and many other things, right? So rather, a positive racial identity means you maybe spent some time learning about who you are as a racial being in this world. So both the privileges and the disadvantages that it affords you, and how your racial identity affects your experiences, right, of others in the world. And racial identity development for people of color, right? There's, I know you can't see, or if you're looking at the handout, you can just kind of flip back to the model that Sarah just talked about, that we see conformity and integrative awareness, right? Those two are similar, but what actually happens, you know, in those stages is not similar, right? So the most important part, I think, of racial identity development, and that even though I'm going to talk about these linearly, like they're not linear, right? Like these can, you know, somebody can be at any stage in their development, which you will see as I start to just talk a little bit more about them, right? And it looks different for everybody. This is not the same for every person of color. So conformity. So in this stage, a person of color is oblivious to the existence of racism. So we probably may more see this in, maybe kids or younger adolescents or so. Maybe not even adolescents, that's actually even a stretch, but maybe kids, maybe young kids, right? So we start to, in this sense, we are ascribing to white norms and values and behaviors without question, right? So we're just thinking that it's part of being a good person. And some of our, imitation of whiteness is really driven by the norms of whiteness over people of color. So in other words, we think that white norms are positive and that they're good, and that there's no recognition in this stage at all. And then we have dissonance. So as a person of color, we start to experience one or more critical incidents of racism and realize that the world may not be as fair and equitable as we thought it was when it comes to race. So prime example, we experience racism ourselves, right? We ask ourselves a series of questions. What did that happen? Did I do something wrong? And when I think about this, I just recall a story of the very first time I was called the N-word. As I had mentioned, I grew up, in a multiracial family. My mother's husband's German, very Catholic man. And I grew up going to Catholic school in Missouri, right? So my brother and I were the only two Black kids in a whole entire school of kindergarten through eighth grade, actually. And the fifth grade was the first time I was actually called this word. And I remember I knew the word was bad, but I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand why he would call me that word, right? It's like, I've been going to school with you for fifth grade. Like, where does this come from? And I recall having this very visceral reaction. In fact, I chokeslammed his ass on the table. And I ended up getting expelled from school, right? I ended up, right, they were going to suspend me and all of these things. And this was like my very first experience with, facing, expulsion from this school, and having my mother's husband, who is a white man, right, really defend me. Like, he came in, and as I think about it, it almost like gives me a pounding in my chest that he slammed his fist on the table. It was like, you will not do this to my kid. Like, where is the responsibility for this other kid? So that was like really a whole understanding, like, oh, that's wrong. Like, nobody should call me that. But I still was holding this question. I never even, right to this day, I probably never will know why. Like, why did he do that? I'm a nice person. I'm a good person. Why was that directed at me? And so the experience, right, is not only shocking, and it's unexpected, right? It's unfair, but then that leads, right, to some suspicion of white people. And then we really start to begin to see the world as a person of color. We start to see the world a little bit differently. And then we have immersion, right? And so we notice, right, more and more of racial inequities in ourselves and other people of color. And so we start to feel anger towards white people. We don't feel as safe being around, right? Because we can't trust them. And we just start to assume that all white people are racist. And then we move to immersion, right? In this category, we really become engrossed in our own racial community due to the distrust that we have and that we hold towards white people based off, right, these continuous experiences. So we start to experience an even greater need to start to connect with members of our own race and other people so that we feel comforted and validated and heard, especially when we do experience racism. We start to avoid, right, white majority spaces when we can seek out community of other people that look like us, or maybe that have experienced some of the same experiences we have. And so as a target of racism, we really feel the need to be aware that racist incidents can happen, and we always have to be prepared to act, right, or react. And we start seeking connection, we seek solace, understanding about these shared experiences of racism within our own racial groups. And we can think of these experiences of, right, racial immersion as really healing spaces for people of color. And people talk about, right, learning strategies, how to cope with racism, how to stand up against racism, and start to feel experience of pride in the race that they hold and identify with. And then we have internalization, right? So this category People of color, BIPOC people, individuals have positive experiences with white people. Maybe those who are doing anti-racist work, who are working to challenge racism in positive ways, right? We also start to explore who we are in terms of social class and gender, sexual orientation, all of these things. And so people of color start to acknowledge that we're more than just our race, right? I know for me that I think coming to work at Head Heart Therapy was really the first time in my life where I felt like, okay, Sarah is a white person that I can truly trust. And she will tell you herself, that took a long time for me to get there. I was a clam. There was no, you could try to pry me open. There's no way in hell that I was going to let, like, I don't know this white lady. Like, no, like, I'm not going to show up this way. And that was my own work, right? That was my own fear experiences that I'd had with white people just throughout my life. And a belief that I honestly just held throughout my life because of things that I have experienced. And then we have integrative awareness, right? So at this point in our racial, development, we experience the capacity to really reach out to more racially diverse groups, right? We start to build community with people who don't look like us. We don't feel we're less than another racial group, but we're very still aware of how racism works. And we start to value these pieces of our racial identity and the identities that we hold, and that continuously change. And so as Sarah and I talk about, talk about both of these models, I'm always, and maybe some of you can even share or throw it in the chat if you'd like, are there pieces, and I see some of you actually, typing things in as I'm talking, right? Are there pieces of the model that feel familiar to you and maybe fit your own racial identity development? Which parts are those? What are you actually noticing internally? What's happening for you as I talk about some of these things that are painful, right? So this is something that we hold and that we continue to evolve over time, right? And how we are setting our own personal intentions to continue learning, to continue changing and shifting as we lean into our own identities. And maybe these models don't fit for you, and that's fine too, right? It's not a one size fits all. Maybe there's pieces of this like, oh, screw that model. That has nothing to do with me. That's okay too. You can hold that as well.
Yep, as she said, there's so many different models. So research what feels relevant to your experience. So now we're going to move into, we promised we would teach you, how do we do this in the therapy space? And obviously these topics, they show up very individually for different clients and of course different therapists. And so we decided to just tell you stories of our own experience. So in white supremacy, really there's a particular value is worship of the written word. And in that, it's basically like the belief that science is paramount to everything else, so that we would ignore intuition, we wouldn't value storytelling, right? We only value research that's peer-reviewed. And actually, storytelling is a really valid method of education in a lot of Indigenous and people of color's cultures. And so we're using this as a tool to further our understanding of these concepts today, and not just relying on the didactic information. So I'm going to share with you two of my clients, one a white client and one a client of color, to talk about this identity development and how we worked with it within the therapy space. So I have one client who is, she's a single mom and a business owner, a white woman. And if any of you follow us on Instagram, Head Heart Therapy, I post often. I post things about racial justice, social justice, those sorts of ideas. And when, in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered and there were riots happening, I really made a conscious effort to make that part of the regular information that I'd be sharing on there. And I didn't think about talking to my clients before I did that. And my clients all noticed that I did that. And I made those changes, and they all know I'm the one behind the phone doing all the stuff. And so when things were at the height of the racial reckoning, this client came to me and she said, I really am I'm concerned that I'm not anti-racist enough to be your client anymore. And I was so proud of her for being able to bring that to me. And that really opened a space to have discussions about how she was showing up as a white person, you know, the guilt and the shame that she was feeling about not doing enough. We've had multiple discussions about the power that she holds as an employer for more what we, you know, are terming unskilled labor, but we are knowing that these people are actually essential to the functioning of our societies, right? So she employs people, often they're people of color, people from a lower socioeconomic status. And so we will often talk about the discomfort that she feels in needing to hold certain boundaries for employing folks, and yet recognizing that she's participating in a racist capitalist society. And she does everything she can to try to not exploit the people that she's employing, but also all of us who own small businesses also know that there's only so much that we can do to help people and to really create change. And so it's an ongoing discussion that we have. And I continue to, you know, gently challenge and invite her into thinking about different ways that her whiteness and her privilege as a person with means and as a business owner impact the people around her. And then I have this other client who is an Asian woman. She's also a mother, a married mother. And when she first came to me, she would say things like, yeah, I'm Asian, but not really. Like, it doesn't matter. She would basically just pretend that she was a white person. She's married to a white man. And there were times where I would hear her say things that my internal alarm bells of, you know, hearing the internalized racial oppression were going off in me. And so in the room, I'm sitting with the discomfort of, you know, I don't want to tell her that she's experiencing internalized racial oppression because that's not my job to do. But on the other hand, I wanted to create a space for her to explore who she is as an Asian person. And in March of 2021, when the murders happened in Atlanta, the murders of Asian women that were working in massage parlors, and then there was more, of course, violence against Asian people happening as a result of COVID, right? Everyone was calling it the China virus. And she began to recognize herself as an Asian person, really started to feel unsafe, and rightly so. She's a runner, and she said, every time I run in this particular area, she said, I feel like someone is just going to jump out and punch me, and there's nowhere for me to go. And so I think about that, and I think if I didn't know what I do know about anti-racism, I might have dismissed her concerns as being, you know, hypervigilance that isn't necessary, right? I could have easily, you know, just tried to say like, well, that's your anxiety. That's not going to happen where you live. And I really could have caused harm by doing that. And so what I encouraged her to do actually was find a support group for Asian folks. And luckily in my network, somebody had shared it. I don't know if it was on the Chicago Therapist Facebook group or what, but I found a group where she could go, and she only went, I think, once or twice, but afterwards she recognized, she's like, that's exactly what I needed. I needed to be around people who were having the same experience as I was, who were able to employ, you know, support systems and whatever else in order to care for themselves. And she, at the end of this, has really embraced anti-racism and recognized, like, I'm an Asian woman, and I get to be in that experience, and I get to move through the world that way instead of the way that she was moving before, in essence, sort of pretending that she was just white. So it, you know, when I think about these two experiences, I really think of this as like a shared growth, right? I am growing in my experience of anti-racism and my understanding of myself as a white racialized person, and I'm supporting my clients in experiencing and developing their identities as well. Rayell?
Yeah, I am. So most of my clients that I work with identify as people of color. So many different identities. So I do have quite a few, Black clients, but I also have Asian clients. I have Latinx clients. I have a whole host of clients, and I also have a couple of white clients. And so I just want to first talk about what my work has actually looked like with my white identifying clients who have, they've been with me, since I started at Head Heart. And so, and I think that there's a shift that's happened to me and how I show up, just through my own personal healing journey and how I'm showing up with my clients, right? And which Sarah and I will get into here in a little bit about just this liberatory framework and practice of also how we operate with our and how we work, not operate, but how we work with our clients, how we show up with our clients, right? Not subscribing to all of these institutionalized views of, what it means to show up as a therapist, right? And I think with the pandemic, a lot of us, hell, I know myself, I'm like, oh shit, these clients can see inside of my house. Like, let me find a corner, right? I don't want them to see, damn, they're going to know I got a red couch. They're going to know, right, my color scheme, all these crazy things that I'm thinking that I think a lot of us probably can identify with, right, even how we've even shown up in our work with clients. And so I think after, George Floyd was murdered, right, and this continued racial unrest, really, not that it's never been happening, but more people were talking about it, right? There was no way you couldn't go on social media and not see something about an unarmed Black man being killed, or you couldn't turn on the news about, right, seeing all of these things right in front of you. There was no way if you're watching TV or you're using social media. And, I took that opportunity. I know that, right, I feel like we're taught in school, like, oh, your clients come to session and they bring what they want to talk about to session. And while, yes, I still honor and support that. And I think at that time that, it was difficult for me being a Black person with my white clients with this elephant in the room, right? You see that I'm a Black person, you see that I'm human. That's something that I continuously, to this day, voice to my clients, right? I'm a person, I'm a human on this other side of the computer screen. And so I framed it with my clients as, hey, I want to start off our session today with talking about something that's deeply important to me. And I'd like for us to just get in this cushy ass bubble together. There's no judgment for me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what's coming up for you. And I want this really to be a shared experience between the two of us. I'm even willing to be, there's a piece of vulnerability that's going to come out here, which is Sarah's putting her hands on her face because, oh no, that's not the V word. No, that's not for me. But that's part of my own personal journey and healing, right? That I'm leaning more into as I even do this work. And so the way I framed it is just come here, ask me questions. Are you curious what it's like for me to be a Black person in the world? Right? I give you permission to ask me. I'm giving you permission. If you don't sound stupid, tell me. Let's talk about it. Because I think sometimes there's, right, people will hold a fear of even, asking questions, right? And at the moment I did that, it was like a weight off of their shoulders, like, oh my God, like, I didn't know if it was appropriate to ask you how you're holding, how you're doing all of this. And it really just deepened my relationship with those clients who are still my clients very much today. And it's actually shifted how they're living their own lives and doing anti-racist work and the conversations that they're having with family, how they're stepping into discomfort and really opening up dialogue and having conversations. So I'll continue to hold that. And I do that with my clients that are not Black identifying as well, right? The conversation of, me being a Black woman is a topic that is a conversation that I think is very important to have in the therapy space. And then in turn, I have my clients also of color who, again, right, as this racial unrest, as it continues, that I think, right, most people think of, you go on the south side or west side of Chicago and talk about therapy, like, oh no, that's for white people. Like, I don't do that. Like, why would I do that? Why would I go to therapy? Why would I talk to what I'm thinking is probably a white person about problems, right? And then in turn, I'm thinking, oh, this person doesn't care. They don't care what's happening to me in my life. So even the stigma and things that are still held, right, in predominantly, Black and brown communities, which, you know, I don't know who all in here is from Chicago, but we can see how segregated Chicago is. There's no, that's just the fact of the city that we live in. And, you know, my clients, it was almost like this bittersweet emotional feeling that I got clients who finally felt safe enough to look for somebody that looks like them, that I actually exist, that I actually can hold space, and I can be, I can be in space with the client to feel seen, to feel heard, for somebody to see them that they know probably has experienced something similar, or just the weight that we all were carrying and still are carrying to this day. And so my clients, I don't take this actual model and, you know, read it to my clients and say, oh, where do you find yourself in the model? Now, if you want to do that, that's at your discretion, not telling anybody how to show up with their clients or how they bring up these conversations. But I think sometimes it's helpful, right, for us to have some type of guide that supports us in having these conversations, especially if we notice there's a lot of discomfort and we haven't had those conversations. But my clients really frame it of how they're actually stepping into, you know, the ownership of who they are. And there's this sense of just deep, just power and being true and authentic, regardless, right, of how people see you. So really, you know, again, stepping to the edge of the cliff, you know, to really test the bounds and discomfort of themselves, and to watch this growth that continuously happens is pretty incredible. And just even some of my, you know, my male clients that are that male identifying, of just this strong, you know, sense of what it means to be male, right? Crying in front of me, crying in front of therapists, hell, even come into therapy, and how that they have, right, shown some softness and vulnerability to know that it's okay to be human, right? Like, I am a Black person who lives with depression, and I can come here and cry, and that's okay. So it's been really incredible to be able to hold space for the complexities of two different clients and client experiences that I've worked with and will continue to work with.
Thanks, Rayell. There was a question by Jeffrey that I think was probably about my experience with my client. So Jeffrey says, I'm wondering if you could share how you would have approached your Asian clients' internalized experience had the killings of Asian women not happened. So, I mean, it's hard to, you know, predict exactly what I would have done, but before that happened, what I did do was, when I would hear her say something that I thought was probably internalized oppression, you know, I can't think of anything offhand about what she would say, but it's probably things between her and her husband. If her husband would, you know, say something racially charged or whatnot, and I thought that the basis of it was racist, I would just invite curiosity and say, oh, I totally understand, you know, what you're saying and what your experience is, but that actually strikes me as racist. And just sharing, you know, my experience of the question. You know, she and I had a really good, we still work together. We have a really good rapport. So I knew I could say that and it wouldn't feel threatening to her. And basically she was like, oh, really? And that just invited her own internal curiosity, which I think created more of a space for her to more readily come to me once the killings had happened and she was experiencing, you know, the fear of threat against her and her children. So that's a great question, Jeffrey. Thank you. So moving on to internalized or injected racial oppression and superiority. So the term internalized racial oppression or internalized racial superiority is the one that you will hear most often. And that's a social justice theory. Rayell and I, in fact, our whole team, part of our team is doing a training right now with an educator, an activist named Shauna Murray Brown. She's a social worker out of Baltimore. Absolutely incredible. If you ever have a chance to study with her, see her speak, you know, she was on my podcast. I adore her, and she is just incredible. I can't speak highly enough about her. And she introduced, in the material that she shared with us, she really centers Black educators and Black wisdom. And so she brought forth this injected racial oppression and superiority by a man named Baba Wakesa Madzimoyo. So he's an educator, researcher, and trainer out of Atlanta. And the reason that he uses the term injected is it's more, I guess it more readily captures the experience of the oppressor injecting this racial oppression into folks rather than, it's internalized. I don't know how that happened, right? Injected is it's a more honest way of looking at this term. So Rayell's going to share with you internalized racial oppression, and then I will discuss more internalized racial superiority.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm just going to start by reading the definition here, right? So internalized injected racial oppression, a complex multi-generational socialization process that teaches people of color to believe, accept, and live out negative societal definitions of the self to fit into and live out inferior societal roles. So these behaviors support and help maintain the race construct, right? So this development of ideas and beliefs and actions, right, that really support and collude with racism, as I had mentioned earlier in my definitions, right? These experiences of expression and discrimination, they are inward, right? And so we begin to feel that the stereotypes and the misinformation that society communicates are true, right? And so we know that racism, it doesn't just impact us personally, but it impacts us culturally. It impacts us spiritually. And racism operates on all of us mentally, emotionally, physically, right? All of these ways. And so when it targets us, we internalize that targeting, right? And when racism benefits us, we internalize the privileging. So constructed racist oppression, which typically is affecting communities of color, right, is historically constructed, right? This historic, systemic, ongoing, continuation, right? It's not just personal or individual, it extends outside to the cultural piece, to the collective. It penetrates every aspect of our personal and institutional and cultural lives. It includes prejudice, it includes, right, feelings and attitudes and behaviors against people of color that are not okay, that are painful, that are harmful. It includes exclusion, discrimination against, suspicion, fear, or hatred of people of color. It sees people of color as only a member of a group, right, and not as individuals. It includes low expectations by white people for children, right, and adults of color. And people of color really have oftentimes fewer options and choices and opportunities to excel and move ahead. And then the internalized inferiority or racist oppression, right, continuing to affect, BIPOC communities, right? It carries out internalized negative messages about ourselves and about other people of color. We believe that there's something wrong with being a person of color. We can see this in lowered self-esteem, right? Sense of inferiority, this sense of feeling wrongness, imposter syndrome, having lowered expectations, this limited sense of potential for self, having, again, limited choices, right? Acting in, this idea of whiteness, or acting out, this idea of disruption, having a sense of limited possibility that's limited by oppression and prejudice. And this cycles through generation after generation. And it's this very deep wound, right? That we probably, this has been going on for generation after generation. And now it's like this residue, of this unresolved historical trauma, which is why we see the highest imprisonment in our country, right? The highest use of illicit drugs and substances, homicide rates, all kinds of things.
Thanks, Rayell. So moving on to internalized racial superiority, which is a complex multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and live out superior societal definitions of self and fit into and live out superior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, white supremacy. So when I first read this, and I thought to myself, like, I don't think I'm superior or better than, I don't live as if, my shit don't stink and I'm walking around thinking I'm better than people of color. And it's not about my individual beliefs. It's really more of this covert socialization process that happens with us that we don't have ready awareness of unless we bring it to our attention. So I wanted to read you a couple of things from, I think part of this is from Robin DiAngelo. And then I have some resources at the end that show some handouts and things you can Google to find this information. So when we think about white privilege is an invisible knapsack of special provisions and blank checks. And that's from Peggy McIntosh. White privilege is the default. To be white in America is to not have to think about it. White privilege is where you expect to be seen as individual, that what we do never reflects on the white race. If we have white privilege, we can choose to avoid the impact of racism without penalty. If we're experiencing white privilege, we live in a world where our worth and our personhood as white people are continually validated. And although white people are also hurt by racism, we can live just fine without ever having to deal with it. And then this internalized white superiority, these are some beliefs underneath this ideology that my worldview is the universal worldview. Our standards and norms are universal, which is a lot of the harms that have been caused by only white people, often white men, having developed a lot of the ideas about what mental health is and modalities in order to heal it, because we've been, it's been whitewashed, not really understanding the experiences of people of color that are different from white folks. My achievements have to do with me, not my membership in the white group. I have a right to be comfortable. And if I'm not comfortable, then whoever is making me uncomfortable is to blame. I can feel that I personally earned through work and merit any and all of my success. Equating acts of unfairness experienced by white people with systemic racism experienced by people of color. So essentially, this is where if one of the issues that some folks have in understanding this internalized racial superiority is white folks who don't have capital privilege, right? They might be of lower socioeconomic status. And so they might move through the world and say, well, I'm just as oppressed as people of color. And yes, they do experience prejudice and a lack of privilege due to the money that they have, but it has nothing to do with the color of their skin. It just has to do with the money that they don't have. I have many choices, as I should. Everyone else has those same choices. I am not responsible for what happened before, nor do I have to know anything about it. I have a right to be ignorant. So, I was taught by a scholar named Robin Henderson Espinoza that especially in the US, we have really shitty historical memory, and we don't recognize where we've been. And so we don't necessarily know how we got here. So that's one of the ways I've been really trying to practice anti-racism, is not even necessarily the direct education about anti-racism itself, but learning about the history of our country, the history of, politics, and how we got to a place where Donald Trump was elected president, right? Understanding everything that led up to that, rather than being ignorant. And then lastly, I assume race equity benefits only people of color. So this is the, Rayell, what's the term? You can read my mind. Do you know what I'm talking about? Nah. It's like when affirmative action, right? So affirmative action, I think there's actually a debate right now happening of whether affirmative action is we are going to continue utilizing it in certain areas. And that's just thinking that, like, okay, so somebody who has less experience as me, but they're a person of color, would get my spot instead. It's really thinking about things from like a competitive standpoint rather than recognizing it's supporting people who didn't have the same opportunities that we had as white folks. So those are just some examples of what that looks like. So now some stories from session. Do you want to go first? Or do you want me to go first? I'll go first. Okay, since I'm already unmuted. So I'm getting up my notes here. So I had a client who is no longer my client. And part of the reason that he's no longer my client, I think, is because of ideological differences that really came out in the process via COVID. So this person, he was actually my first patient when I worked in a treatment center. And then he ended up relapsing, and I was in private practice at the time. And so he started to work with me. So we knew each other for almost 10 years. And so we'd had a really long relationship. I'd supported him through, addiction and recovery and divorce and suicidal ideation and all sorts of stuff. So we had a really deep history. And when the racial reckoning happened, well, actually, I guess the first thing that came up between us was I saw him the day after the 2016 election. And my experience in Chicago was that the whole city was like in a fog. And I remember going into Starbucks that day and just going like, how is this the world we're living in? And I made the assumption incorrectly that all of my clients were liberal, which duh me. So of course we talked about it in sessions that day. And my client said, oh, well, I voted for Trump. And that was my first recognition of, it wasn't my first. There were some definite cues before then that I had sort of brushed under the rug. But so that was a moment for me to really recognize the ideological differences that we were dealing with. And so when the racial reckoning was going on, and as I said before, I really intentionally shifted what I was doing on social media and Instagram in order to support what I believe is the right side of history. He sent me a text message, and it said all of the things that I just read you, like pretty much word for word. He said, I'm uncomfortable. You are making me uncomfortable. And I don't think we can work together anymore. He talked about his experience as his parents were immigrants from a different country, but he's white. And so he would use that experience and say, well, I'm just the same. And I never acted like, these people who were rioting, reiterating his belief in meritocracy, that everybody had the same privileges as him. And it was, and of course, like most of us would do, I said, I can completely understand this is really painful for you. I really hope that we actually could either have a phone discussion if you really don't want to come back to session, or if you are willing to come back to session and we can talk about this together. And, this was it literally was the hardest experience, I think, of my career, because the way that I held it was, if I had a client who was in active addiction, I wouldn't collude with their addiction. And I would challenge whether or not that addiction was healthy for them. And there are some people that you will meet who disagree that this is the way to hold it, but this is what I have chosen for myself in my practice. And so when he shared these things with me, of course, I validated the fear, I validated the pain, because those experiences are real. But I challenged some of the belief systems that he was sharing in the most gentle way that I could. And we were able to move through that session. And what was really interesting, he ended up talking about in detail later, was how he was being ostracized by all of his friends. So he actually came back at one point and he said, I appreciate that you are a liberal person who I can have discussions with, because my deeply liberal friends have all just rejected me, and they say that I'm just racist and I'm a horrible person, and they won't speak to me anymore. And we did end up ending our work together, because I think the tension, truthfully, for both of us got to be too much. And he ended up moving out of state anyway. So it was kind of like, we were both like, phew, we don't have to deal with that. That's over. But man, that was one of the biggest growing edges of my career in terms of, doing really difficult, challenging work with clients with different ideologies. So Rayell, to you.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, it's my experience working with, my clients of color, right? And really supporting them through, holding an awareness, right, of internalized or injected, racial oppression. And that a lot of them, when they came to therapy, they were not able to name that, right? There was no recognition of the racial trauma piece, or from a collective standpoint, what was actually happening internally. There was no awareness. It was just like, okay, I'm going through the motions, these things are happening. And I think a lot of our work has really shifted to, how am I stepping into this authenticity of who I am, and still, right, doing anti-racist work, social justice work, all of these things, and owning this piece of me. But I think of it as, right, being a person of color, or any of you who, hopefully all of you out there are social justice warriors, right? Part of us making collective change means that we become a part of the system too, right? We have to become a part of the system in order to make collective change from within. That's how it works. It's not just a matter of like, oh, I believe this, I believe this. This is why this piece of action, right, is a really important part of what it looks like to, to make change and to see shifts. And so a lot of my clients, even still, I think they kind of, bounce back and forth, between the identity model of how they're experiencing racism in the world. A lot of my clients work in, all white spaces. And so holding this awareness of how they show up, right, in white spaces, to either maybe cower themselves to not be seen, or how they want to be seen and how they want to be heard. So I have, clients on kind of, two ends of the spectrum of what it actually means to show up in predominantly white spaces, right? And to be met with, well, no space is safe, right? We hear safe space, safe space. No space in this world is safe for me. Now I can show up with some level, right, of bravery and how I lean into, just my own authenticity of how I show up, but no space is actually safe. And so part of my work with clients is, right, is not to get them to do this thing, or, try to make them believe this thing, right? It's just supporting, holding, and honoring how they show up in the world, and all of the strategies and things that they do to survive, which is it's more complex when working with clients of color. Just because as much as I can be in therapy myself, I'm not going to walk outside and not be on guard or be, right, aware of my surroundings. That's never probably going to happen for me. And I can just speak from my personal experience, and just some of the things that, how my clients may identify with something very similar. So it's this ongoing process of, right, it's like I learned all of these things unintentionally, and now it's a part of unlearning, right, of undoing, which is a really big part of this work too, as we educate ourselves on this historical piece of just the world that we live in.
Awesome. So now we're going to move into, I'm realizing, wow, we do not have enough time left. And Rayell, we got a really awesome question that I kind of want to workshop with this person who asked, but I want to try to run through some of this stuff before we do that. So we're not going to get to the experiential today. So y'all will just have to play with that on your own. But I found this resource. The book is called Racism and Mental Health. And it's British. So you can tell by some of the words that it's British. And this particular article within the book is centered around the Black experience. But I thought it was just really beautiful to look at these different ways of how, as therapists, we can empower and disempower our clients in the room. So I'm just going to read this page, and then there's another page with some bullet points that you can look at as well. So we empower when we acknowledge and value cultural differences. We disempower when we use our ethnic and cultural differences to pathologize. We empower when we allow clients to express their culture and spirituality in their own way. And we disempower when we let fear of the unknown force clients into action that blocks out necessary cultural and spiritual modes of expression. So I actually have a beautiful friend who's a lovely example of this. She is a Black woman, and she really has embraced, she's like, you know what, I am all about Indigenous wisdom now. And she actually decided to let go of her therapy practice because she just really felt like the rules about what it means to be a therapist get in the way of her being the spiritual being that she wants to be, and gets in the way of her clients being able to be the spiritual beings that they want to be. So Mashera Winston, if you want to check her out, she's on Instagram and all the things. So we empower when we recognize and acknowledge that personal and institutionalized racism is very real, a very real feature in Black people's everyday lives. And we disempower when we assume that clients have a chip on their shoulder if they talk about racism and racist attitudes and behavior they've encountered. So yeah, Angie, the next page, all of this is on the handout. So if somebody, maybe Dana or Ryan can put the handout in the chat again, that'd be amazing. We empower when we take responsibility for challenging racist behavior and comments, whether from staff or other patients. And we disempower when we ignore or make excuses for racist behavior or comments. Rayell, can we talk about the example that happened really early when you came into the practice? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, but I'll talk about it if you just remind me.
Yeah, it's when it was one of your clients. What did she say? You know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
You want to share?
So my history is not working in private practice, right? Which oftentimes private practices are very white-centered spaces. And of course, when I came to the practice, majority, if not all of my clients were white identifying. And this is, this client, she's still a client of mine. And when I came, I don't remember the context of what we were talking about, but she was talking about, coming from a family of just a financial privilege of being, wealthy and all of these things. And she was just like, oh, like, you may not understand what I mean. So she, I guess, because I'm Black, she thought that I maybe didn't come from a place of privilege or from financial privilege, or she automatically assumed that because I'm Black, that maybe I've had this life of, I don't know what stereotype she held about Black people, but I think oftentimes, right, that shows up. And sometimes how we see other people, that we just carry these stereotypes and assumptions without actually holding any awareness or knowledge of somebody else's experience.
And what happened was Rayell brought that to me in supervision. And when I look back on it, I actually wonder if that was part of, like, not, I don't think you were overtly testing me, but I feel like often when I meet a person of color, there's a vetting process that I go through. This is what I make up in my head. And that moment felt like one of those for me where, had I invalidated you, or because you came in, you were like, I think this was racism. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. And had I invalidated you, or had I kind of stuck up for that client, I think that would have potentially shifted. And I want to hear your experience on this, right? Like that would have shifted our interactions and the safety that you would feel with me as your supervisor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you heard what I said, and it was never a, like, oh, I'm sure she didn't, there was no invalidation of what I experienced. And right, just me having that experience. That's not the first, or probably not the last time that somebody's going to hold that, maybe stereotype about me. And so, I think even part of, doing this work, Sarah asked me, she said, what would it look like for you to bring this up with the client? And I immediately, no, coward, no. Like, I want to, no, let me be a good Black therapist and not do this thing to make my white client uncomfortable. And that was, ultimately the conversation that we had. So, even as we kind of talk, and as I'm talking too, like, how I show up, or the things that I do, right, to create this, safety, or not do this thing to be this person for my white identifying clients. And ultimately, I did end up having a conversation with her, and it was, oh my gosh, no, right? It was just the, while she made the comment, her intention was not rooted in a place of malice. And that really added so much depth to our relationship and actually how we work together. That she's able to, right? You can make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. That's just part of the learning process. And I will continue to make mistakes. Sarah's going to continue to make mistakes. Hell, all of you are going to continue to make mistakes. There's no person on this planet who is absolutely 100% anti-racist, and you're not going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. And a piece of that too is trusting that you're going to be okay when you make the mistake too, right? You trust that there is going to be discomfort, that you're going to come out on the other end, and that you learn something from that, right? Growth always comes from that place.
Absolutely. So I am so sad that we are running out of time and we're not going to get to everything that I wanted to today, but I wanted to share with you. So this is from the Racial Healing Handbook again. So, if you want a starting place to think about what this work is going to look like, start with this book, because I think it's a great opportunity to dig in. And I can share with you some of the ways that we enact these in our practice. So the first piece, grieve and name racism. So I guess it's the first Monday of every month, we have dedicated our meeting with our staff to talk about racism, anti-oppression, and we did Shauna Murray Brown's course, which we've talked about. Right now, we're going through Politicizing Your Practice by Dr. Jennifer Mullen. And so that's giving us springboards to talk about this. And we've had really, really heartful and difficult discussions about our participation in the mental health industry, how we've perpetuated white supremacy. Raising racial consciousness. So, when I'm in these courses with Jennifer Mullen or Shauna Murray Brown, they have really curated people of color's voices, really important voices within the mental health communities. And so I feel like that's one way that we've tried to diversify our learning and understanding more about how racism interacts with the mental health system. Catching ourselves in the flow of racism. So one thing that came up, we're recognizing that we're going to need to have a talk with our staff about what is an anti-racist liberation practice and what is white fragility in practice, because one of our staff members, we just recognized she is not charging late fees to her Black client specifically because he's Black. And Rayell, do you want to share about, or do you want me to just finish this piece? Okay. So, obviously if we're running a business, we can't just, people who are coming as clients, there is a negotiated contract that we have that you are paying for our time, whether you come or not, if you don't cancel within the allotted 24 hours, right? And so the conversation that we have to have with this clinician is the practice of holding him accountable. It actually is infantilizing if you don't charge him just because he's Black. It's not actually an anti-racist practice, right? The practice of supporting somebody in developing boundaries is that we need to do as therapists, regardless of what somebody's race is. And her being able to say, like, look, if you need to budget your money, that's great. You also need to budget your time. And so if you're going to cancel, you can totally do that, more than 24 hours in advance, but I do have to hold this boundary here. We also think about, the way that we are diagnosing clients. That's something else that we hold in terms of how can I be more liberatory in the way that I'm using the DSM, either using it against people or just doing what I need to do in order for us to function within the system. Understanding racism in relationships. I think we've talked a lot about that already. Also reclaiming our whole racial self. So exploring these other identities. Being a racial ally. So that means believing the experiences. So just like Rayell and I just spoke about, if you are a person who holds power, believing when somebody says, I think this was racism. Engaging in collective racial healing. That's what we're doing today. I really believe that if you showed up today, you're a person who wants to heal in this area. Knowing your racial identity. So what is the journey that you've gone on? How does that impact your relationship with your clients and your relationship with colleagues? Exploring this internalized racism or superiority, right? How does this influence who you are as a therapist and who you are as a colleague? And then lastly, relearn the history of racism. So there is no excuse in today's age for not learning more about our history in mental health and just in this country in general. And we do have a resource list here that if you've downloaded and I'll put a link in the slides as we end this, but there's a lot of resources here for you. And Shelby, I really wanted to get to your question, but I feel like 5 minutes is not going to be appropriate. So I'm just going to put this question out for everybody to consider. The question was, what are some ways as a white passing therapist to challenge internalized racism with clients of color? So I'm just going to put that out there for people to digest because it's such a wonderful question. And Rayell, do you want to take us out?
Yeah. So what's next? What does this mean? What do I do with this information, right? How do I support my clients? I think it's, so important as we're doing, this work, is part of it is having a level of awareness of what happens to us internally, right? When we are faced with some of these challenges, when we're actually, stepping into our own learning or taking action, right? So this is just an invitation for all of you, right? To step into, what am I willing to commit myself to be on this journey? It's a never ending journey. It doesn't ever end, right? What am I willing to do, right? To step into, understanding and continuously learning, being able to hold space and support my clients and myself. What does that look like for me? So I hope that there was, a nugget or two that all of you were able to take away from the information that we shared today. And of course, continue to do your work.
So we do have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to see if anyone has questions that are, we're going to be able to answer in a good enough way in the next 3 minutes. So are there any questions or comments? I'd love to hear what people are leaving with today. Let's see. So we've got a raised hand. Let me get to that. All right, Zoom is being a little temperamental right now. Dana, if you can see the raised hand and you're able to, here we go. I can get to participants now. Okay, Lavita, I think you should be able to unmute now.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you so much, ladies. I really appreciate this. What does RBST mean again? RBST?
Race-based traumatic stress, which is the same thing as racial trauma. It's the same thing as racial stress.
Okay. It was written. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, ladies. I really appreciated this presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Anybody else with our last moment? All right, Carolyn, hello. I think.
Whoops. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
First off, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful. It was so good to see you up there. So if you don't mind just sharing your experience, Sarah, when I know for you, you're obviously out in the community as someone who advocates for racial justice and anti-racism. So I'm assuming most of your clients would know that going into work with you. But if you were working with a brand new patient of color, how would you navigate that space with them? Do you just introduce yourself and say, hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a white therapist in a position of power working with you? How do you, so for me as a white clinician, potentially working with a new patient who identifies as a person of color, how to start having these conversations? I don't know if you can answer that in a minute, but just throwing it out there.
I mean, truthfully, I would signal in some way in your marketing materials, whether that be on your website or your LinkedIn or your Psychology Today profile, just something about the work that you're doing in that space internally with anti-racism. And I think the Instagram handle is the Fat Sex Therapist, and she basically, somebody asked a question like, can white people show up for people and be therapists for people of color? And she said, yes, you can. But instead of, just trying to be there to support people of color, why don't white people do the work to dismantle the racism with other white people? So that's not to say that you shouldn't work with clients of color, but if a client of color is coming to you, then absolutely bring it up in the room. But beforehand, having that signal out there so people know what it is that they're getting into, I think is good. Does that help? If
That's
not,
very helpful.
Later.
I'll text you, but thank you so much, Sarah and Rayell. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
You got it. Thank you. All right, so it's noon and we want to respect everybody's time. So thank you so very much for being here. Rayell, anything you want to say?
Nope, thank you all for your time. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
All right, since we are still all here, we'll just say a quick thank you so much, Rayell and Sarah. This was absolutely amazing. And I think not only informative, but truly motivating. And we're seeing that as all these comments are coming through about not only just thank you for the webinar, but also they're going to take this, everyone's taking it in their work, moving forward too. So that's really awesome feedback. So thank you.
Thank you guys.